Miss Producer, Unfiltered. Woo!
Hi.
Hello, hello.
Okay, so Ido Aharoni Aronoff is an Israeli diplomat, and Ido, I'm going to let you take it from here. Tell us a little bit about yourself. And also, for those of you who think that the Jews only existed in Israel after 1948, Ido's family has been settling in Israel since the 1870s. So just wanted to preface the interview with that fun little fact.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Nicole. And we met when you worked on this wonderful series, Spy Ops, which I had the pleasure of participating in that. And yeah, so I was born and raised in Israel, 1962. My family came many, many years ago. From my father's side, they came from what is today Uzbekistan in the 1870s. From my mother's side, they came from Yemen, what is in 1912. My mother was born in Tel Aviv. My father was raised in Jerusalem. And I was born and raised in a southern suburb of Tel Aviv called Holon. Just like every of my peers, I went to the army. And after the army, I went to college, to Tel Aviv U. And then I came to the States. I got my master's in communications from Emerson College. And then went back to Israel. I worked a little bit for Israeli television. And then I joined the Foreign Service. I spent 25 years in the Israeli Foreign Service. My last position was Consul General in New York. I held that position for 6 years, and then I retired from government, not retired from work. I've never been busier, I must say. And I'm now running my own business. I have a consultancy firm. I do a lot of public speaking. I teach at universities and so on. And so I'm very, very busy, very happy with the opportunity given to me to continue to do what I really like to do, which is to teach. Really, I'm a teacher at heart.
Okay, so teach us, please teach us. Tell us, I'm going to just dive right in. Tell us about a little bit about the political landscape in Israel. I feel like people don't really understand, especially the Jews in America, why people hate Bibi so much. Is that really the case, or is that just what we're seeing on the news? What's it like in Israel?
Well, there's you can't dispute the fact that there's a Bibi fatigue, a Netanyahu fatigue, and the fatigue is natural. It's understandable. The person has been around since the mid 1990s. Was a very young prime minister during his first term, and then he came back in 2009, and with the exception of 1 year, hasn't really left. So there's an understandable fatigue. Add to that the fact that he's not very strong in showing emotions and gestures. Like, for example, if you remember, after the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, Bill Clinton said, Shalom Chaver, came to the funeral. He gave a very emotional speech, and people connect with emotions. He's not very good in that department. So that creates a certain kind of alienation. And then on top of it, you can dismiss public opinion surveys, but they've been very, very consistent. People don't want to see him prime minister again, a vast majority of Israelis. And so that's the reality. Now, of course, the man deserves a lot of credit for many of the things that he did. But, 16 years as a prime minister may be too long, too much.
And is that just because of fatigue, or does that have something to do with his policies as well?
Well, I think it has to do more with his conduct, the way he treats or mistreats people. Most of the people that worked for him at one point or another turned against him. It's not a good sign. And so, it adds up. It adds up.
Okay,
So
on
by,
this,
by the
yeah.
way, by the way, the Likud has never been, the Likud under Netanyahu has never been as popular as the Likud under, let's say, Menachem Begin or any other Likud prime minister. They fared much better than Mr. Netanyahu in national elections. Under Begin, Shamir, Sharon, they all reached much better results than Netanyahu. So even as a leader of Likud under Netanyahu has not done as well as it did under Begin, Sharon, Shamir, and so on.
Okay, so about that, can you explain to us the different parties and in the Israeli parliament and the coalition system. Like, does his not being popular right now have to do with the coalition that he made in order to get elected? Is that how he even got elected? How does
Yeah,
someone who's
so
not so popular get elected again?
all right, so there's a very good question, and there's a very simple answer to that question, and that is that a coalition agreement is a legal agreement between several parties. That's the difference between the Israeli system and, let's say, the American system. The American system, you have the presidential system, you have lots of checks and balances. In Israel, the system was designed in a far more fragile way, if you may. Whereas by the virtue of having a parliamentary majority, which is a requirement to form a government, the executive branch, actually controls the legislative branch. So we don't really have the same checks and balances that you have here in the United States, and we're left only with the judicial branch of the system. So in order for you to form a government, to build a government, you have to have a majority of over 60 in the Israeli parliament out of 120 members. And so you have to sign agreements with other coalition partners. Now, those coalition partners, and they may be very small factions, they have demands, and sometimes you cave in to those demands, and sometimes you don't. Depends on the demands. Usually, when the demands are out of the consensus, for example, the issue of military service, when you have political parties that demand as part of their agreement to join the coalition, they want an exemption for military service. So the Israeli public could tolerate that for many, many years until 10/7. After 10/7, unacceptable to most Israelis, including religious Israelis, by the way. So the Haredi are in a total isolation on this issue. Yet Mr. Netanyahu is working diligently to allow them to pass legislation that will keep them in his coalition. In other words, the secret, in addition to his really genius political tactics, the secret is he was willing to give his coalition partners things that no other prime minister was ever willing to give in the past. That's the reason why that's the explanation to his extraordinary survivability.
Okay. And this specific coalition that he made with the Haredim, why is this so precious? Like, why is this something that people are just, they've had enough?
Well, I don't think it's precious. I think that for politicians, and I worked, alongside many of them, some of them view political survival as the most important thing, and I suspect that's the case with Mr. Netanyahu. So his survival, the survival of his coalition, is the number one priority, and I can understand why, because that's the whole purpose of him being in politics, is to be in power. Every politician wants to be in power, and by the way, every politician would like to have, at least to a certain degree, unrestricted degree of power so that they can execute and implement what they believe in. So, and I've seen prime ministers extremely frustrated with the constraints of the Israeli system. I remember Yitzhak Rabin used to call the people in the bureaucracy in the Ministry of Finance, he used to call them the little Fogels, because the head of the finance ministry at the time, his name was Aaron Fogel, and he used to call them the little Fogels. He hated them, and every prime minister in Israel's history was frustrated with the Israeli bureaucracy, with the civil service, and so on. So it's only natural that they want to have more power, in some cases unrestricted power, and that's exactly what you're seeing all over the world now, not just in Israel. You see it in the United States, you see it in other places. So there are very big differences between the American system and the Israeli system. We don't have a constitution, for example. The fact that we don't have a constitution is a big disadvantage, because a constitution is basically a set of basic guidelines. We all agree on basic principles, and we play within the boundaries of that ballpark. In Israel's case, there is no ballpark. The second big difference is that, again, we don't have presidential systems, which means that the prime minister is not a president. The prime minister doesn't have immunity. The prime minister, according to the Israeli law, is first among equals. And we've had prime ministers that ended their career in prison. because of that very reason. There is no immunity. And it's very easy to believe that in Israel, the prime minister is the president. He's not. And some prime ministers do behave like presidents, and that's the source of their troubles, the legal troubles. In Israel, you don't vote for a person, you vote for a party. So it's not that I vote for Netanyahu. I vote for Likud, headed by Netanyahu. It's a big difference. Legally, huge difference. Another fundamental difference between the Israeli system and the American system is that in the Israeli system, there's a gravitation towards the center. Everybody wants to be a centrist. Nobody wants to be labeled as an extremist or as a radical in Israel. In the United States, what we're seeing is exactly the opposite. The gravitation is towards the extremes of the political system. In Israel, the gravitation is towards the center. It's a very big difference. And again, you can never discount the experience of someone like, for example, Mr. Netanyahu, who's perhaps the best campaigner we've had in Israel's political history, perhaps the most skilled politician we've had in Israel's history in terms of his ability to cut deals and to maintain his coalition. Take the example of Naftali Bennett. He was the prime minister for a year, although there is a consensus that he was a good manager, but he was a complete failure as a politician. He was even unable to keep intact his own little faction of 7 people that he brought into the coalition. He had also selected the wrong people to his party. Half of them left the party and joined the rivals. So there's so much to be said about the Israeli system. It's far more complex than any system that I know.
So what is the solution then?
Well, I mean, we have to respect the rules of the game. Whoever has the parliamentary majority and is able to form a coalition is governing, and that's exactly what you're seeing now in Israel. There is no political pathway to bring down the government unless it is being brought down from within. Let me give you an example. If President Trump, for example, is going to present a deal with the Saudis that will include some sort of political horizon for the Palestinians, not to mention statehood for the Palestinians, then that would, by definition, present the current coalition with a dilemma which they can't solve. They are opposing any political progress with the Palestinians. And if this is the deal proposed by the president, not to say dictated by President Trump, which also could happen, that he could just simply dictate to Israel, this is the deal. You have to accept it, or all hell will break loose. He can do that. That will ultimately, and I think immediately, will bring down the Israeli coalition. The current coalition will bring it down. There's a scenario where the opposition may approach the coalition and say, if you say yes to the Saudi deal presented by the American president, then we will provide you with a parliamentary safety net, although I don't see the political logic behind it. They'd be better off letting the coalition just collapse. But they may provide the safety net. And we've had that before. When Menachem Begin decided to go into Lebanon, he didn't have a majority. He didn't have a parliamentary majority. He had only 59. And the opposition supported him in his effort to curb Palestinian terrorism in Lebanon. People forget that the only reason we went into Lebanon in 1982, and then it got complicated, but in the beginning, it was because of the unbearable attacks by the PLO at the time from Lebanon to the northern section of Israel, very similar to what Hamas did all those years since they took over Gaza in 2006.
Okay, so if you could explain to us, break it down, what does extreme left look like in Israel? What does extreme right look like in Israel? And what are the parties that are attached to those two sides? And then how can you compare that to the center when you say majority of Israelis lean towards the middle?
Okay, so Israelis, first of all, are very politically savvy. So they read the news, they have opinions that are well based on information, so you can disagree with them, but the Israelis know what they're talking about. They're familiar with the structure of the political system, and above all, they care. You see that in the voting turnout. Voter turnout in Israeli elections is significantly higher than most countries in the West. The exception is municipal elections, where the voter turnout tends to be lower than the national average in elections to the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. So, what you would describe as extreme left, I guess, would be an anti-Zionist party. So, if you say that I don't think that Israel has a right to exist, then what are you doing in the Israeli Knesset to begin with? Right? But there are people especially in the Arab parties, not all of them, a small number of Arab members of the Knesset that are anti-Zionists. And there are a couple of Jews also. So you could say that historically the communists were the extreme left. Some factions of the Arab political system belong to the extreme left. And then on the extreme right, you have people that completely deny the rights of every other person who's not Jewish. That's a form of bigotry. That's a form of racism. So,
Okay, but before, sorry
yeah.
to cut you off. This is a very nuanced, there's going to be a nuanced answer to this, but if you have, Israel is a Jewish state, right? So on the left, you have people that are in Israeli parliament. Okay, like you said, there are Arabs in the Israeli parliament that don't even believe that Israel should exist as a state. How could that be if the extreme right has bigots that don't believe anyone should have a voice? They do have a voice already. And if on the extreme right, they're saying that no one should have a voice, isn't it because they're afraid that parliament, let's say if you're not Jewish and there's a majority in Israel of people that have citizenship that are not Jewish, and they come into parliament and they all decide that Israel shouldn't exist, then Israel could, as you say, destruct from within.
Yeah. So, there's this thing called realpolitik. So you have ideology, beliefs, and I respect all of that. But at the end of the day, there's reality. And in the reality, you have almost 20% of Israeli citizens who are not Jewish. And there are many Jews, by the way, that are counted as Jews who are not halakhically Jewish. Okay, that's another hot potato. What are you going to do with them, right? If you subscribe to that radical view. And then on top of it, you have millions of Palestinians in Gaza and in Judea and Samaria. Whether we like it or not, it's our problem. It's our problem because the Arabs won't do anything about them. By the way, one of the things that President Trump is trying to do, and I believe that his Gaza idea, the evacuation of Gaza, was meant to steer at least a conversation about it in the Arab world, is to signal to the Arab nations, if you think that the Palestinians are Israel's problem solely, then think again. I think that you should pitch in, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, the Emirates, and so on. You should pitch in, and you should be part of the solution. And he introduced this really, out of the box thinking. Let's remove all the people of Gaza from the Gaza Strip, rebuild Gaza, and then we'll decide what to do with it. Who's going to take care of them? Where are you going to take them? Obviously, to one of the Arab nations in the region. He's doing the same thing with Ukraine, by the way, and Europe. He's telling the Europeans, you should also think that Ukraine is your problem, not just my problem. Bringing about a peaceful resolution in the war between Russia and Ukraine is European interest. That's what he's trying to tell them. And at first they were shocked. They didn't like to hear it. But then I think they understood that there's a lot of logic behind it. There's a lot of it makes sense. And the same thing Israelis feel about the Gaza Strip. So to go back to realpolitik. So you have all those millions of people. What are you going to do with them? So there are two ways. One way is to say, I'm strictly adhering to my ideological belief or my religious belief, and that's it. No compromise. But Zionism achieved everything because we were pragmatic and not dogmatic. And what does it mean to be pragmatic? Is to look at the reality and find solutions to the problems that you are facing. And we need to find a solution to the problem of the Palestinians, and we need to be able to live together with those nearly 20% of Israel citizens who are not Jewish. That's the reality. All the rest is irrelevant. It's fantasy.
So regarding the solution, wasn't the withdrawal, the Jewish withdrawal from Gaza in 2005 supposed to be one of the solutions? Wasn't that kind of a layup for the Palestinians to have that area as their own state?
Yeah, so you're referring to the unilateral pullout out of Gaza, which was, in my view, the way it was done was a big mistake. It was totally mishandled by the Israeli government. Not because it was wrong to leave Gaza, it wasn't wrong to leave Gaza, but because it was done as a result of a security consideration and not as part of a geopolitical solution. Not only that we left Gaza, we didn't get any credit for it in the international community. Zero, none whatsoever. Why? Because the Israeli government at the time, headed by Ariel Sharon, failed in presenting it the right way. They presented, and I remember this. I was based in New York at the time, and I remember the summer of 2005. It's the summer I went back to Israel, but I was given the talking points that came in from Jerusalem, and we were specifically instructed to present it as a security move, not as a geopolitical move towards peace or towards a political resolution. So it was the Israeli government made an effort to make sure that the world will not give us credit for it, because we did it for technical security related reasons. Big mistake. If you are going to do this, do it together with the world, with the consent of the superpowers, with a Palestinian partner, so that you at least can get someone responsible for the situation. What happened was that we left Gaza. The United States came and said, against our opinion, but we were in no position, let's hold democratic elections in Gaza. What does it mean to hold democratic elections in Gaza? In the eyes of the people that conceived the idea, democracy begins and ends with the technical procedure called elections. But no, democracy is far more comprehensive than that. It's more deeper than that. And so we allowed the democratic elections to be held in Gaza. I mean, we were not there anymore. The United States basically took over. They sent former president, the late Jimmy Carter, to supervise the elections. And the elections were held in January of 2006. Hamas emerged victorious with 45% of the votes. Number two was Fatah with 41% of the votes. And once Hamas took over, and they won democratically, the first thing they did, they started butchering Fatah, their own Palestinian rival. And by mid-2007, Fatah was kicked out of Gaza brutally and violently, and Hamas became the sole ruler of Gaza. And so when Israel attacked Gaza post 10/7, it wasn't just attacking Hamas. It was attacking a rogue entity governed by Hamas. But we view Gaza to be a political entity, more than semi-autonomous, because Israel had nothing to do with the day-to-day operations of Gaza for the last 15 years, right? So to go back to your question, yes, so Israel did it. Israel pulled out of Gaza. Perhaps it was for the right reasons, but the way it was done was very clumsy, and showed no diplomatic sophistication on the part of Israel's government at the time.
So now going back to the political landscape of Israel, when you say most Israelis are leaning towards the middle, what does it look like for them? What does the solution look like for them?
So most Israelis care about unity. It's one of the reasons people are very upset with Mr. Netanyahu, that he's not doing enough to unite the people. Is constantly sharing with the public divisive messages, attacking his political rivals as if they're not legitimate. They are legitimate. And it's a binary view of reality. So unity would be the first thing. And again, one of the reasons Naftali Bennett is so popular is because he is speaking that language of unity. He's not being divisive. So that's the first thing that draws people to the center. The second thing is people are tired of talking and dealing with the Palestinian issue. People want the Israeli society to begin a process of internal healing from the inside. And one of the things that divided Israelis in recent years was the attempt of this government, the last several years, to undermine the independence of the judicial branch of the Israeli system. And people, again, regardless of where you stand on this issue, people just want to see the government involved actively and proactively in the healing of the rifts within Israeli society itself. And then obviously people care about, quality of life issues. They want to have better health. They want to know that their tax money is being spent in the places where it should be spent. When people read headlines about the reckless handling of the budget and the really outrageous agreements with the ultra-Orthodox parties, then makes people angry, including myself. I get angry when I see this. They don't serve in the army, and they're being given a disproportionately high number, large portion of the budget. Totally unfair, and Israelis are fed up with that.
So, but with regards to this situation specifically, what does the solution look like? Is there, are you
There's
a
nothing to
supporter?
resolve.
Okay.
There's nothing to resolve. That's the way the Israeli system is designed. Many people expressed dissatisfaction with the Israeli system over the years, and there were many, many attempts to change the system. Say, we need a presidential system, we need this, we need that, we need a constitution. Maybe a constitution is a good idea. I don't see how we reach an agreement over a constitution.
Well,
And so,
sorry again to cut you off, but the Constitution, the way it was explained to me, the lack of Constitution is because Israel is constantly in a state of defense. So if you have a Constitution, it's kind of harder for the military to, decide.
no, it has nothing to do with it.
So
The
what
reason
is
why
it?
we didn't have a constitution is because Ben Gurion at the time had bigger fish to fry. You have to understand when the state of Israel was founded. So you have to understand the sequence of events. Okay, so there's a UN partition plan in late November of 1947, that says basically the two-state solution, right? The United Nations dictates, let's create a Jewish state and Arab state. The Jews, remember, are always pragmatic. That's what kept us alive, is the fact that we were pragmatic. That's what worries me about people in Israeli political life today that are not pragmatic. Israel said immediately yes, because if they give you something, take it. Take it as long as you can, and then put your foot in the door. Israel says yes. The David Ben Gurion says yes. There's pre-statehood Israel. The Arabs, of course, dogmatic, say no. And immediately tensions rise in pre-statehood Israel, in Palestine at the time. And violence begins, although it's not a full-blown war. But Ben Gurion knows that he has about 6 months to prepare for the war, because once the British mandate ends, and that was the implication really, then he was fully aware of the fact that the Arabs are going to attack. And indeed, when the British mandate ends and he proclaims Israel's independence in mid-May of 1948, so you have from late November until mid-May, that was the time Ben Gurion had to prepare an army. And he did prepare an army. Many volunteers came from the United States. Thousands of them came to help. And remember, we didn't have an Air Force, we didn't have a Navy, we didn't have an armored corps, we barely had any ammunition, and the soldiers were not very well trained. Many of them were immigrants, newcomers. Some of them were survivors. Imagine people that survived the horrors of the Holocaust were prepared to take a rifle and fight against the Arabs, right? And so the war breaks out, and that was the main effort of the government to survive. So Menachem Begin, who was a leader of the opposition, proposed a constitution. He said, you promised the people that you're going to produce a constitution. But Ben Gurion didn't have the bandwidth to deal with it. They looked at the Proclamation of Independence as a legal foundation for a future constitution. And then, like it often happens in politics, they reached a compromise. And the compromise was that we're going to pass what we call basic laws on major issues like privacy, security, like the IDF law. The IDF exists under law. It's called the IDF law. And all those basic laws one day will amount to a full constitution. That was the logic. And we are, if you may, in the middle of that process.
So that's what I was that's what I was alluding to, is that it always seems like there's bigger fish to fry and no one can really sit down and work this out because there's always a war, there's always an attack, there's always something that needs to be addressed first. But survivor mode, I mean, is Israel not still in survivor mode?
Yes, of course. But there are many other countries. By the way, there are several countries in the world that do not have constitution, but they have instead a very long history of legal precedents, like, for example, the British system or the system in New Zealand. But Israel doesn't have a constitution, but remember, Israel is very young. So if two historians will have a conversation about Israel's constitution 1,000 years from now, they will look at the year to 2025 as the very beginning of Israel, right?
Inshallah, 1,000 years from now.
Yeah,
people are still,
I believe that. I believe that people will be talking about Israel 1,000 years from now, and Israel will still be around. Of course, there's no doubt in my mind. And we have to look at it from an historical perspective. We are in the process of becoming a nation. We're just in the very, very beginning. It's true that we don't have a great track record when you look at history, when it comes to the ability of the Jews to maintain sovereignty and to maintain their own independence. It happened only twice throughout history, and in both cases, put together, combined, wasn't more than 120 years. But I think that that this time we live in a different world. I think that there's a different system. And I don't see why Israel, as a society that was smart enough to create one of the most exciting knowledge-based economies, will not be able to continue to make a great contribution to the family of nations.
Absolutely, we already are,
Yeah, and I believe that will continue.
Okay, so again, what does the center believe? Obviously, okay, we want to change the system, but before that happens, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen anytime soon. What is the solution to the Palestinian and Israeli tension?
So, there are several. If you ask me, my opinion, I think that 10-7 basically took off the table the idea of Palestinian statehood as was conceived by past governments and past American administrations. I think that the main reason why I'm saying this is off the table is because the Israelis don't believe that anymore. So they may intellectually say, yes, in theory, two-state solution or three-state solution, right? Because Gaza and West Bank are two separate entities. And I don't think that there's any interest post 10-7 of letting Gaza connect with Judea and Samaria, right? We don't want the Palestinians in Gaza to influence the Palestinians in the West Bank. So it's a big issue. So we may even look at the three-state solution. But the Israelis, I think they look at it.
What is the three-state solution?
It's what's happening now. Gaza is a separate entity than Judea and Samaria, than the West Bank. Two different things, two different political systems, two different rulers. So de facto, you're looking at three different entities: Gaza, the West Bank, known as Judea and Samaria, and Israel. But all that can change. Let me explain why. So post 10/7, I think Israelis lost faith in the, not lost faith, they don't believe in the urgency of finding a solution right now. See, right now, what we need to do is separate us from them. We need to protect ourselves. We need to take better care of our army. We need to be able to produce, for example, our own ammunition. We need to boost our brand so that our country is strong and we have strong reputation. When you have strong reputation, it's easier to get international legitimacy, for example, which is something Israel lacks severely since 10/7, and so on and so forth. There's so many things that we need to do first before we take care of the Palestinians. Also, remember that when we speak about peace in the Middle East, the definition of peace in the Middle East is very different than the definition of peace in Europe or in North America. We're not talking about having the relationship the United States has with Canada. We're talking about some form of non-belligerency, meaning let's agree not to kill each other. And let's agree that we are going to achieve some sort of a livable arrangement that will allow us to live side by side without violence. That's why we are emphasizing normalization rather than peace. People say, let's have normal relations. We don't have to have peace agreements. Let's have normal relationship. So Israelis will tell you probably that we want the Palestinians to run their own affairs, but we also have to make sure that Israel's security needs are being met. For example, Palestinians will not have an army. I think it's clear. The Palestinians, in any future agreement, Palestinians are not going to be able to control their own borders, right? We're not going to let them have an air force or submarines or navy or any of that. One of the reasons after the collapse of the Assad regime that Israel attacked the most strategic assets of the Syrian army and the navy and the air force is because of that fear. We don't know who's going to take over in Syria, right? This guy we know is a former Al-Qaeda guy. The last thing we want is Al-Qaeda people with access to submarines and air force and ballistic missiles. So Israel had to destroy all of that infrastructure in order to make sure that it doesn't fall in the wrong hands. The same thing goes for the Palestinians. So there could be some sort of an arrangement, but it will definitely, for sure, will not include a complete Palestinian independence as people may have envisioned in past years.
Okay, so now I read in the paper today that it's official that Israel is going to be taking over Gaza, and already 30% of Gaza is under Israeli control right now. Why did they make this decision?
Well, I guess, again, it's a security decision. It's not a political decision. It's not an ideological decision. It's a security decision. That's the best way to protect Israelis is by having troops on the ground. But then again, what if soldiers will die? What if the presence of the IDF in Gaza will be so costly, so unbearable? We've had that before. We've had that before in Lebanon. We were in Lebanon for 18 years. Hundreds and hundreds of soldiers were killed. We were in Gaza for many, many years. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of soldiers were killed. And so there's going to be ultimately a public pressure to get out of there. And again, to separate. There are no easy solutions because the reality is not simple. The reality is very, very complex. And don't forget the American factor. We have a new president that comes into the office with a new level of energy, with new ideas. One of the ideas we discussed already is what is commonly referred to as Gaza Lago, which I love that. I love that name that was attached to it. And I think it's a very effective way to steer the kind of conversation that we need to have about the future of Gaza. That involves the Arabs, that involves Saudi Arabia, that involves Egypt. Why the whole world is looking up to Israel to find a solution to Gaza? What about Egypt? Right?
Weren't the Egyptians offered Gaza back in a peace agreement and refused? They took just
Yes,
the Sinai
of course.
Peninsula, but not. And why is that?
Of course, they always refuse because you have to understand the World War II created a massive refugee problem of over 20 million people, among them 1 million Jewish refugees from Arab countries, which no one is talking about.
No one talks about that.
But all those refugees were settled. They were settled in Russia, in Poland, in Ukraine, in Israel, in all sorts of places. The only group that since 1945 had not been settled are the Palestinians, or the so-called Palestinians, because we don't even know. And it's a funny thing that those people who accuse Israel of a genocide. Well, if Israel was indeed interested in killing and annihilating the Palestinian people, it's probably the worst, clumsiest genocide in history, because the number of Palestinians has gone up from 200,000 in 45 to millions today, right? So what kind of genocide is this? But more seriously, the issue is that the Palestinians were exploited by the Arab countries to put pressure on Israel. It became part of the Cold War. The Soviets were part of it back then, and I'm afraid that the Russians are now taking the position of the Soviets. They were totally supportive of Hamas after 10/7. And so were the Chinese, by the way. So it's just another indication that we're back into some type of Cold War again between the anti-American axis and the United States. And so nobody really wanted to solve the Palestinian problem. And as Menachem Begin always used to say, this was never about the Palestinian state. This was always about the Jewish state. What bothered them is not that the Palestinians don't have a state. What bothered them is the Jews have a state. And so maybe President Trump will be the one that will introduce a solution that will be, in the eyes of some people, radical, but maybe will be effective. And I think that what he's doing with the Arab world is very, very important. It's actually historically important that he's pushing them to play a proactive role in reimagining and redesigning and executing the day after in Gaza.
I think it's also a different era in which Trump could actually do something like that. If we were talking about something like this 50, 60 years ago, it would not have been possible, because the Saudis wouldn't even listen to something like that.
Correct. And there's also the argument of the linkage. So the linkage was a concept that was introduced by the Americans actually in the 1960s, 1970s, that after the Six-Day War, they said, if you want to understand the Middle East, if you want to understand the complexity of the Middle East, you have to understand that everything is linked to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So if you want to bring about stability to the Middle East, you have to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict first. So it became the top priority. And indeed, everybody was talking about the Palestinians, right? You have hundreds of thousands of people dying in Syria. Nobody cares. Hundreds of thousands of people dying in Darfur. Nobody cares. Everybody's talking about the Palestinians because someone was working hard to convince all of us that there's a linkage, right? Everything is linked. That's the event that explains the Middle East, the Six-Day War. Well, we are now beginning to realize that the event that explains the Middle East actually happened 1,500 years ago, and that's the divide within Islam between Sunnis and Shiites. That's the only valid explanation to the Middle East, to what's happening even today. And so when you look at the Middle East today, and and again, when you see President Trump's foreign policy, and it's too early for me to draw conclusions, but it seems to me that he is working under the assumption that the United States is currently overstretched. And if the United States wants to be able to effectively deal with the number one challenge, I don't want to use the word threat, it's a challenge, which is China, the United States has to basically reconfigure its international presence. And that's what they're doing. And so the world is, in President Trump's view, is divided into spheres of influence. The Chinese have their own sphere of influence. The Russians have their own sphere of influence. And the American sphere of influence includes on the one hand, Canada and Mexico, but also Greenland and Panama, and also the Gaza Strip. In his view, and this is again what I'm able to conclude so far. It's too early in the game, but this is what I'm able to conclude so far, that this is what we're looking at, a new approach, and maybe that approach would mean at one point that the United States will dictate, and again the emphasis in the word dictate, to its countries, the affiliates, the people that are part of their camp. They will dictate a solution if the country is reluctant to do that. And I don't rule this out in the case of Israel. I think that there's certainly a scenario where Mr. Trump will present Israel with a solution. Let me remind you that the Abraham Accords were 100% the making of the Trump administration. It was not, it was something that the Trump administration prepared and presented to the Israelis. The Israelis, for their part, tried to talk about the annexation of Judea and Samaria only 3 weeks before the Abraham Accords were announced. So the Israelis were not even part of that game.
Yeah. What's concerning to me, though, is that that was Trump 1.0, and then he only had 4 years. And then within 3 months of Biden winning, all of that got shot to hell when Israel was attacked again. So it almost seems like there's so much promise right now, but in a couple of years from now, when the administration in America changes again, I mean, who knows what could happen?
Correct.
So is that a
Although,
reliable basket to put your egg in?
again, it's there's best example, although it's a small symbolic thing, but it's still a valid example. So U.S. administrations don't really have a tradition of completely deserting or neglecting their longstanding policies. So if one administration is making a certain decision, it will be very rare. I'm talking about foreign policy, very rare for another administration to completely, like what we're seeing with Russia, Ukraine. But Trump made a decision to move the embassy, or to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. So it wasn't just about the embassy, it was the recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Many people are unaware of the fact that most countries in the world do not recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. And in fact, there were a few Jewish organizations that did not recognize that until the 1990s, without going into names. But the point is that you had a different administration that didn't really change that decision. The Trump administration recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. This was not reversed by the following administration. And so, of course, the Abraham Accords, a big achievement of the previous Trump administration, and I believe that normalization with Saudi Arabia will be the crowning achievement of the current Trump administration. And I don't see any reason why any future administration, whether Republican or Democrat, doesn't matter, will try to change that. I think it's a great achievement, and I think that if indeed President Trump will be able to deliver on this promise, there will be a huge achievement of American foreign policy of historical proportions.
Now, what I am alluding to here is, I understand that when I ask about, what does the future look like in terms of a solution with Palestinian-Israeli tensions right now, you're saying right now that it's all about security and we have to separate ourselves just to be safe. But it seems like the answer to any type of idea of a solution is in the hands of America right now. Are there any Israeli ideas? Is there a fight over something?
No. There are no Israeli ideas, and the reason again is because the current coalition in Israel, doesn't believe in that. I mean, you can argue whether it's right or wrong, but these are the policies of the current government. They're not interested in that. This is not their policy. They're against Palestinian statehood. They're against forget Palestinian statehood. They're against any negotiations with the Palestinians. One of the reasons we are in this predicament right now is because of the fact that this government and previous governments in Israel thought naively that we'd be better off with Hamas than with the Palestinian Authority. Why? Because the Palestinian Authority demands negotiations over Palestinian statehood. Because we are against Palestinian statehood, it would be better off with Hamas, because with Hamas, it's not about statehood. And of course, the sour grapes of that approach, we all witnessed and experienced painfully on 10/7. We forgot to do the most basic thing, which is to read the Hamas charter. And we learned a very, very painful lesson.
I mean, I still okay, we're talking about the Israelis and what the Israelis are thinking, but I don't understand what Hamas is thinking. I mean, what is their end goal? Talk about their charter. What is
Yeah,
their end goal? Why are they not surrendering? What are they doing?
Right. They are radicals, fanatics, religious zealots. You can't reason with them. They operate based on a religious belief. What is their issue? Their issue is modernity. The enemy is modernity. The enemy is everything that that negates their fundamental view of the world, which is to go back to the days of thousands of years ago. And one of the manifestations of that, viewing modernity as the enemy, of course, is to relinquish power or control, especially control over women. Boko Haram, which is another radical Islamist organization operating in Nigeria, abducted 300 girls. They did not abduct 300 people, 300 men, 300 boys. They abducted 300 girls. And look at what's happening in Iran when it comes to women and the control over women. And look what the Yazidis did to women, and so on and so forth. So it's really about control. It has very little to do. I remember when I was many, many years ago, 20 years ago, when I was based in New York representing the state of Israel, the American media used to refer to the then leader of Hamas, Ahmad Yassin, as the spiritual leader of Hamas, Sheikh Ahmad Yassin. And I used to correct them that there's nothing spiritual about Sheikh Ahmad Yassin. He's a deadly, dangerous human being who wants to annihilate the Western civilization. He wants to annihilate modernity. He wants to annihilate the United States and Israel and so on. And but that's part of the naivete of Western media.
So I'm so happy that you said that word naivete, because I'm just beside myself when I see people who think that Hamas has a point. People who are sympathizers with Hamas, people who see them as a resistance movement. I mean,
Right.
how do you explain that?
So based on my experience, there are two groups that basically say more or less the same thing for different reasons. You have the people that confuse Hamas with the Palestinian cause in general. So they want freedom for the Palestinians, and that's a great thing. There are many Israelis that want the Palestinians to have a good life. I want the Palestinians to have a good life. I'm sure you do.
Of course.
And so they confuse the legitimate claims the Palestinians may have against Israel, against the international community, whatever, with Hamas. For them, it's the same thing. I tend to see them mostly, on social media. These are the people that don't really, I'll give you an example. So I was watching this TV show last night, and I usually, when I watch TV shows with cast members that I don't recognize, I Google them up and I try to read about them. And so there was one actress from Canada, very young actress, 25 years old, not very well known. And I just went into her Instagram account, and she has pictures, and then in her, in the line where the stories are, so she has a story about how she shot that series and she this movie, blah blah blah, and then there's a story, a bundle of stories under For Palestine.
Yeah.
And I just went in and I wanted to see what does she want for Palestine, and it turns out that she wants the bombings to end. And it's the only thing she cares about. You didn't see anything there about, not even about Me Too. It was for Palestine was the only thing that existed, which was not personal. So I take this person as a member of that group. Okay, so then you have the second group of people that exploit the Palestinian issue to basically express their most Kamaic, hidden, deep, hatred of Jews in Israel. In that group, I will include someone like Ta-Nehisi Coates, for example, who wrote a book, I'm told, it's called The Message, which he starts the chapter about Israel by saying, more or less, he said, I went to Jerusalem to visit, I went to Yad Vashem in Palestine. So in his mind, Israel is so despicable. Israel is such an ancient sin that you don't even mention Israel by name. In his mind, Yad Vashem is in Palestine. Israel doesn't even exist in his mind. The Israelis don't even deserve to be heard in his mind because he wrote the whole book about the Palestinian point of view without even mentioning Israel once, not even interviewing one Israeli for the book, right? And to think that this book was published by a legitimate publisher in America, that an editor actually went over the text and approved it. And so that's the group of people that I call them the new anti-Semites. This is mostly people that think that Israel shouldn't exist. So there's two different groups here. They say the same thing, but they come from two different places. The first group comes from a place of ignorance. They don't know, they're uninterested. The second group knows a lot. And that's why when they make that claim, we shouldn't give them any discounts. We should fight them and fight them I'm grateful for this administration for really sanctioning and punishing heavily those students and graduates that instigated terror and horror on campus and expressed anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist views. And it's very important to understand that if you say that Israel has no right to exist, but you have no problem with, let's say, what's happening in Iran or in Darfur or in China or in Syria, what's the definition of racism? The discriminatory singling out of a group because of its identity. That's exactly what it is. So these people are just modern day racists. They may think that they're not racist, but they are.
As a pragmatist, how do you approach a situation like that? It seems hopeless because no matter how much, if I say something like, okay, they rejected several peace deals, then someone will just say those peace deals weren't good enough. Like, how do you explain to someone that it's not about the fucking peace deal? It's not about that. It's about, like how you said it before, it's not about a Palestinian state. It's about a Jewish state and the fact that it exists. And that's what really bothers people.
Right, correct. So first of all, good news. Most American students do not support those radicals. They did not support the encampments. And this is even, I read a story about that even yesterday, but this has been very consistent since 10/7. So despite of all the atrocities that we've seen on campus and the embarrassing testimonies of the presidents of the universities, especially Claudine Gay, on December 5th to 2023, there's a solid majority of American students, over 80%, that oppose those radicals. So that's the good news. Another piece of good news, there's a very strong majority, the American people, that put the blame on the Palestinians and particularly on Hamas for 10/7, and that believe that Israel has the right and the legitimacy to defend itself and do whatever it needs to be done in order to remove the threat that is called Hamas and Palestinian terrorism. So despite of our subjective, personal, individual experience, the truth is that there's a majority out there of people that totally understand what Israel is doing and supports Israel. We should never forget that. We should never forget that. So it's very easy to let the small vocal minority to grab all the attention. But it would be a strategic mistake to let them do that. Now, to go back to your question, so if you remember, I spoke about two groups. The first that speaks out of ignorance, and the second that speaks based on knowledge. Those who speak out of ignorance are definitely the majority. I would reach out to them. And the way to reach out to them is basically to expose them to Israel. And unfortunately, and I speak of that as someone who was deeply involved. The state of Israel didn't do enough to expose the totality of life in Israel. What we've done over the years is constantly argue about the conflict, having conversations like we're having now, which is good, it's important to have, but it can never be the only conversation you have about Israel. Because if the only thing we talk about are Israel's problems with the Palestinians or with this or with that, then Israel is etched in people's minds only as associated to conflict, bloodshed, danger, and so on. Whereas the reality is that Israel is a real place. And conflict is only one dimension of life in Israel. There are many other dimensions, and Israel can be a lot of fun, and Israel can be very positive, and people actually have a great time when they go to Israel, even during the crisis. And so once you do that, once you broaden the scope through which Israel is being perceived, only good things happen to the brand. Only good things happen to Israel. Only good things happen to Israel's reputation when you broaden that scope. And we haven't done enough. I'll give you an example.
What about birthright?
Well, birthright is among Jews. That's great.
But again, I think I agree with you, but I think that we're probably desensitized. Like, for example, I also think Israel is amazing, and I have the best time every time I go there, and I have family there, and it's beaches and restaurants and a good time and a lot of young people and music festivals and beautiful history and ancient history, and like the Bible comes to life when you go on all these tours, the vineyards, it's amazing. But because my family is Israeli and I go there, when I see soldiers carrying M16s, it's very normal for me. Or I'm desensitized a little bit to it. But if I'm trying to convince my husband, for example, to come to Israel, who's not Israeli, he's scared. He's like, "What are you talking about?" He's like, "Yeah, I'm sure it's a great time, but maybe we should wait a little." It is a dangerous place. And I tried going there when I was there. The last time I was there, actually, when I came to interview you for Spy Ops, I was hanging out in Yaffo with a friend of mine. And I remember walking outside of the Soho House, beautiful, fancy place in Yaffo. I came outside and I was like, I'm in the Middle East. This is actually pretty intense. On the way home from our interview with you, we stopped at checkpoints on the highway on the way back to Tel Aviv. People were looking, the military was looking for terrorists. They were checking every single car. When you go into a mall, your bag is being checked. When you try to go into a parking garage, your trunk is being opened by the guards. Like there's a mile before you get to the airport, they're searching your car. This is, you're in the Middle East when you're there.
Yeah.
So it's kind of hard to say, yes, we should expose all the beautiful things too. Like, especially during conflict, like we're able as Jews and as Israelis to still, have this like thirst for life. But to your average person, they're scared of these things. It's not normal. That's not a normal setting.
Right. Totally understandable. And I think you're right. However, the fact that it's hard doesn't mean that you don't do it. We have to do it because our future depends upon it.
Yeah.
And if Israel will not broaden the scope, if Israel will not engage in a conversation that includes more dimensions of life in Israel, then the only thing people will know about Israel is that Israel is associated with conflict, and there's no growth there. Nothing will grow other than the people that support Israel. So we'll end up with the Jews that love Israel and a few Christians that love Israel. That's not how you grow. And I'm not just talking about tourism. Tourism pre-COVID stood at 5 million a year. We were talking about 15, 20 million tourists a year. Forget tourism. I'm talking about, people that don't have the resources to spend the money to come to Israel. There are so many ways for Israel to reach out to them without them physically coming to Israel. There's so many ways to do it, but we're not doing it. We're not even thinking about it because we are obsessed with the need to win the debate about the conflict. And it's important to win the debate about the conflict, don't get me wrong, but it can never be the only conversation we engage. There is nothing in it for us.
Yeah,
So
it's
let's
like we're
say you
all
agree.
little kids seeking validation from our parents,
Right, exactly. Even the
Yeah.
people that say, yes, I agree with you, I support your view. As you said, there's the psychological barrier. They're not going to engage with Israel because who are they going to invest? I talk a lot about Warren Buffett. I tell people, did you know that Warren Buffett invested in an Israeli company called Iskar? Billions. I forgot the exact amount that he invested in Iskar, but the timing of the investment was July of 2006.
Mm.
Iskar's factory was on the border with Lebanon. The war with Lebanon erupted on June of 2006, or a month and a half after the war broke out. Warren Buffett makes a decision to invest in Iskar. And when he was asked why, he said, because it's a good investment. That's what you want, right?
Mhm.
He was able to see Israel in a much larger, wider prism, not just conflict. He understood, I'm in LA right now. I was here when the fire broke out. And it's true, we saw the ashes coming down. I'm on the west side of LA, so we were south of the fires. Um, and I thought to myself a few days after the fires that it would be very difficult. I had to go to my dentist in the San Fernando Valley. And I said to myself, probably the roads are going to be empty because the city just experienced this massive historical devastation. It was packed,
Mhm.
traffic jam, as if nothing happened. And the answer to that question, how come? How can it be? Is that life has its own inertia. During the high days of Second Intifada, Israel was known. If there was a bombing in the morning in a cafe, in the afternoon, the cafe was operating again. There was a bus driver whose bus was attacked in Jerusalem at 8 a.m. By 2 p.m., he was already driving again. And so,
That's the Israeli way. That's
right,
the Israeli way.
but
Well,
life has its own inertia. I have a friend that survived two bombings in one day.
oh my God.
One day in Jerusalem, he survived two bombings.
As a Muslim. Oh my God. He should have bought a lotto ticket that 5 minutes later.
Yeah. But my point is that life has its own inertia, and we can't let that one dimension of Israel. Now, I know it's difficult to imagine after 10/7 a situation where we don't let that dimension overshadow and dominate the whole conversation. But I'll give you examples from America. How many urban centers we have here? For example, Chicago. I remember one time I went to Chicago and I read a story in the paper and I couldn't believe it, that they had like hundreds of shooting incidents every weekend. Hundreds, not five, not 10, hundreds of shooting incidents. I said, yet I was in Chicago and I felt 100% safe. And we went out. It's a great city, right? So you can't let that element, whether it's crime or terrorism, completely dominate. I lived in New York during 9/11. I was there. I came to New York a few months before 9/11. I was in Manhattan the day of 9/11. And I witnessed the quick recovery of New York. I'm talking about the economy of the city, the nightlife of the city, efforts that were made by the mayor at the time, Michael Bloomberg, to you know open up the city again. I remember, for example, they had this great initiative with restaurants right after 9/11, where the best restaurants in New York offered a discounted menu where you can go to have the best meal of your life for almost nothing, for $30 a person, the best restaurant. And so they incentivized and enticed people to leave home and go out. And people did. And very quickly, New York bounced back in a very big way.
Yeah. So back to the Palestinians. How can they bounce back? Like, why are they, do you think that they're starting to, I saw that they're protesting Hamas in the streets. Do you think that that's maybe a glimpse into, I don't know. What do you think about that?
Well, first of all, we should all be happy that there were a few courageous people that were willing to demonstrate against Hamas. And we can only hope that there are many more people out there that don't like what Hamas is doing. And Hamas, of course, as I mentioned before, is not interested at all in the well-being of the Palestinian people, and they're not even preoccupied with the future of the Palestinians. The future of the Palestinians for them is the past. They want to take the Palestinian people back to the dark ages. And again, the enemy is modernity. That's the enemy. Everything that is modern is the enemy. And so what will happen with the Palestinians deserve much better than what they have, unfortunately. They have a long history of leaders that failed them. And we can put a lot of blame on the Palestinians themselves, but then at the same time, remember, it's a different society, it's a different culture, it's very different than the Israeli culture, it's very different than the American culture. The level of education, the access to information, access to power is very limited. It's very difficult if you're a Palestinian to rebel against your own regime. You don't always have the resources, you don't always have the support, and so on and so forth. So again, in the case of the Palestinians, I believe that what needs to happen is very similar to what happened in Germany and Japan after the war, which is a complete restructuring, not just of the physical infrastructure, but also of the educational infrastructure. One of the big challenges that we have with the Palestinians is what they educate their children. When you see how children are being taught from cradle to hate Jews and to hate Israel, very similar to some groups in America, which I have to say, I'm not an American citizen, but it really bothers me when I hear Americans that hate America. I mean, you can be critical of America, but you can't say America is the source of all evil. America is not the source of all evil. Even if you disagree with a certain politician, many great things happen in America, including medical breakthroughs and technological services and so on and so forth. Life expectancy went up decades in the last 200 years, largely thanks to innovation that came out of America. So we can't say that America is the source of all evil, although, of course, America is not perfect. Israel is not perfect. I would say no country is perfect.
Yeah. And also, I was thinking about the new generation. So here in America, Gen Z is a little bit confused. I'm wondering, what is Gen Z like in Israel?
Very different. Very, very different. And the reason why they're so different is because of the military service. One of the things that I see here in America is that people take for granted the very liberties that they've been granted. They take for granted that America is a democracy. They take for granted all those things that Israelis know they have, maybe because it's a country still young. You know, my son, you could say technically is a Gen Z, but he's acutely aware of the sacrifice that his grandfather made for Israel's independence, right? My father was injured twice during the 1948 war, and was a great patriot, a great Zionist, and so on. And so there's still an element in Israel of people are being judged by their contribution to the collective effort. So it's not entirely a culture that is based on individualism like here, and which is one of the things that we now see about Gen Z. It's all about them. It's how they feel. They use their own feelings as hard evidence. If their feelings are hurt, then they say damage was done. No damage was done. You know,
Yeah.
if you disagree, you know, I've experienced that in the classroom of students that disagree with something and they respond in a very bizarre way. So it's the inability to deal with challenges. It's the inability to deal with complexity, right? All of that may exist in Israel, but to a much lesser degree. And the Israelis are still being judged by their contribution to the collective, especially to the army.
It's so funny. When I was living in Israel, I would go on job interviews, and the first question is always, what was your service? What did you do in the military? And the second I said I didn't serve, it was like, okay, goodbye, you're not getting this job, you know?
Right.
But I'm
Yeah.
American, I wasn't raised here. It doesn't matter. Like, we want to know what you did
Right.
for this
And
country.
and the other thing is that human resources managers really understand the CV of an Israeli who served in the army. Whereas here in America, I noticed many times that people that serve in the army, when they're looking for a job, people outside don't really understand or appreciate the kind of responsibility they had in the army or in the
So they
Navy.
don't know. They can't
So
relate.
they can't relate, they just don't understand because they've never been to the army. So when they see the CV of a military veteran, of the army veteran, and they look at it, it means nothing to them.
Yeah.
Whereas in Israel, they know exactly what it means.
And speaking of the soldiers, what is going on? I heard today that the morale is low and that they're just tired of it and that there's not enough supplies for them.
Well, again, it's what I told you before when we started this conversation. I mentioned that one of the biggest challenges for people, including religious people, so it's not just they're frustrated when they see the Israeli government is working diligently to secure budgets for the ultra-Orthodox and to provide them with the legal exemption of avoiding military service. You know, everybody's talking about equality. Israelis are very sensitive to that. And so there's a limit to what you can ask young people to do, especially when they're looking left and right and they see ultra-Orthodox young people that are not doing anything.
How did that even happen, by the way? Like when you read the Bible, when you read anything in the Tanakh, you're just like, we were warriors. We were always warriors and people of the
Right.
book. So
So it's a
where's the
distortion.
disconnect? Where is the disconnect?
Well, you know, it's like any phenomenon. You will always have those people that take it to the extreme. And ultra orthodoxy is not an ancient phenomenon, as people may think. It's actually a relatively new phenomenon in Jewish
Yeah,
life. In my view, it's a complete distortion of
me
Judaism,
too.
complete distortion. And my grandfather was an Orthodox rabbi. He was not an ultra-Orthodox rabbi. He was a very moderate person. When I say moderate, I mean in terms of his religious beliefs, and very tolerant of people that were different than him.
Hmm.
And he was a rabbi. And my other grandfather was also very religious, but very tolerant. And of course, my other grandfather was a member of the Haganah. He fought, although he was an older man in 1948. He fought in 1948. And so where it came from, you could say it's political wheeling dealing. When the state of Israel was founded, the ultra-Orthodox rabbis came to Ben Gurion and they said, okay, um, you know, we want you to exempt those among us who are considered to be the geniuses, what's called in Hebrew the Ilui. The Ilui is the superb yeshiva students. And Ben Gurion said, okay, how many people we're talking about here? They said 400. They said, okay, fine. And everything was okay until Menachem Begin became prime minister in 1977. And Menachem Begin did two things that are the reason for this horrendous situation that we see today. The first thing that he did, he appointed the Haredi. So the Haredim were part of his coalition, but they didn't have any ministerial executive offices, portfolios. But he gave Mr. Lawrence, who was a very shrewd ultra-Orthodox politician, the chairmanship of the Finance and the Budget Committee in the Knesset. Bad idea. And they ruled the Budget Committee for the entire time Menachem Begin was prime minister. It was first Mr. Lawrence and then Mr. Shapiro. That's the first thing they did. The second thing he did, which was horrible, he basically lifted the quota. He basically gave them an unlimited number. And so what they did, they created a whole bureaucracy where every yeshiva boy is Ilui, is a genius. And that's how the numbers were inflated. So a lot of people blame Ben Gurion for it. And it's true that initially the idea, the principle was set by Ben Gurion, but the person who really opened the gates for the flood was Menachem Begin. And he did it, again, naively. He didn't do it because he wanted political power. He thought it was the right thing to do. He had a soft spot in his heart for the ultra-Orthodox. And today, it's a real danger. It's a real danger to Israel. We talk about hundreds of thousands. We talk about hundreds of we're talking about over 50% of first graders in Israel today are ultra-Orthodox kids.
Oh, wow.
I want you to think what it means 18 years from now.
Right.
It means that the segment of the Israeli population that is carrying the load, that is carrying the weight, is getting smaller and smaller. They're the ones who are paying the taxes. They're the ones who are producing the knowledge that makes Israel into a startup nation. They're the ones who are serving in the army. And the other sector is growing and growing and growing rapidly. They're sucking more and more resources from the state, and they're refusing, at least their rabbinical leadership is refusing to contribute. They're refusing to integrate. I think that rank and file ultra-Orthodox are willing to be part of Israeli society. In fact, many of them are eager. Nobody wants to be poor. But for example, the rabbis will not allow them to study English or math. So if you don't study English and if you don't study math, by the time you're 18, how competitive are you going to be in the job market?
No, but this is absolutely ridiculous. And I really don't understand why the Rabbanut and why this is even allowed. I was sitting next to an ultra-Orthodox girl on the plane on the way home from Israel, and she's not even allowed to study the Gemara. I mean, I went to a modern Orthodox yeshiva and I studied by the time I was 12, I was studying in Aramaic. They taught me Aramaic also, you know? I mean, I just don't understand where things went wrong. I mean, before the 1700s, the ultra-Orthodox community, the Jewish people didn't dress like that or look like that at all.
Right.
That wasn't even a thing.
So,
and who is allowing it to?
The answer to your
they're
question,
running with it.
The answer to your question is very simple. Politics. Again, if you want to rule and they have votes and they have seats in the Knesset, if you want to be able to form a coalition that will be able to rule the state of Israel, you have to have them as part of your coalition, and they will present demands. And the question is, are you going to give them what they want or not?
Well, I think there's just like there should be a reformation of the system. I think this should be part of it. I think there should also be a reformation of the ideology of the ultra-Orthodox movement.
It will probably happen. It takes time for those processes. And the reason why I say this, it will probably happen, is because of those little devices. The rabbis are, again, trying to control, but they can't control those devices. And you see more and more young ultra-Orthodox interested in having a job. In the few programs that we have in Israel, academic programs for ultra-Orthodox men and separately for ultra-Orthodox women, the demand is very, very high, which means that grassroots ultra-Orthodox young men and women want to be part of the Israeli society. They want to integrate. They want to have good jobs. They want to have good income. It's their rabbinical leadership and it's their political representation. So the rabbis are not the ones in the Knesset. Those in the Knesset are usually the wheelers and the dealers, you know, the wheeler-dealer types that the rabbis select to represent them in the Knesset. So I think that ordinary ultra-Orthodox men and women are also frustrated, not just us. They're also frustrated by this.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see where in the Torah it says that you cannot study math or English, or I mean, think about like the Rambam. They were all the commentators in the Bible were all extremely, extremely educated. I mean, they were
Right.
also physicians, they were also experts in medicine and agriculture, and I mean,
Yeah.
what?
Well, don't forget that they don't really study the Bible. They study the commentary. They don't even deal with the actual scriptures. They study the commentary, but yeah, it's not even this is not even a theological argument. There's
Yeah,
nothing here about religion or theology or spirituality. This is all about control.
makes no sense.
It's all about limiting people, limiting their access to information in order to control them. That's the whole story.
Well, it sounds extreme and it sounds like very dangerous to me. And it sounds like we need to learn from the mistakes of our cousins on the other side of the border.
Correct. So Israel has so many challenges, and that's only one of them, many challenges that we're facing. So we have security, we have the socialists. So he asked me back when we started this conversation, he asked me, okay, so what do people in the center want? The people in the center want a government that will be committed to tackle those issues and to tackle them honestly, professionally, in good faith, with no hidden agenda, no manipulation, no divisions, no divisiveness. Just do your job. You know, we elected you to work for us. We don't work for you. You work for us. And unfortunately, too many Israeli politicians switch this. You know how it happens in Hollywood? We have lots of actors and actresses in Hollywood that think that we want to hear their opinion when they receive the Academy Award or the Golden Globe. They have political agenda, blah, blah, blah. And people are fed up with it. Shut up and act.
Yeah.
Shut up and play your music. If you're Roger Waters, we want to hear your music. Well, we used to want to
Well,
hear.
we used to.
Yeah, nobody cares about what you think about the Palestinians. And the same thing is with Israeli politicians. They bring in all sorts of agendas other than what they're actually supposed to do.
Sounds like you guys need to hire Elon Musk.
Well, I don't know if Elon Musk is the solution, but certainly as Israel was able to